Good morning. I want to talk through the fourth face, the image of God in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. So the essay was written in 1998 by Alan Alexander, and it was published in the African American Review. So the fourth face, the image of God in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, begins by talking about the religious references, some Western and some African, in Toni Morrison's fiction. And Alexander says that they are never more intriguing or perplexing than in her novel, The Bluest Eye, which we know is Toni Morrison's first novel. And he says that the many fascinating religious references, there are many, right? But the most complex or the richest are her representations of and allusions to God. So our thesis statement: in Morrison's fictional world, God's characteristics are not limited to those represented by the traditional Western notion of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Instead, God possesses a fourth face, one that is an explanation for all those things: the existence of evil, the suffering of the innocent and just, that just seems so inexplicable in the face of a religious tradition that preaches the omnipotence of a benevolent God. So this idea that there's God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, but then there's also the presence of evil. And so he questions whether Morrison is attempting to redesign Satan. And so he compares this idea to one that presents in Toni Morrison's second novel, Sula. And a quotation that he uses is that the fourth explains Sula. The fourth explains Sula. That there is this representation of God that exists outside of the ones with which we are most familiar. And then he goes on to say that there is an inadequacy as it relates to Western theological models to explain or expound upon Morrison's work. And so he compares Morrison's characters to James Baldwin's John Grimes in Go Tell It on the Mountain, Richard Wright's character in Black Boy, Guitar Baines in Song of Solomon. And so Alexander points out this example of a Black person who seems to be deeply rooted in Black culture, but also doesn't know simple things about Black culture. So Alexander ponders if the distance between one's recognition of Blackness affects one's ability to be rooted in this tradition. So Alexander tells us that Pecola Breedlove actually falls prey to the false notions of white superiority espoused by not only the white community, but also by characters like Soaphead Church and her own mother, Pauline. Alexander points out one example. It's when Pecola Breedlove goes into a store and the shop owner does not even see her. He can't see her because she's a Black girl. And the essay says this: when Pecola encounters Mr. Yakubowski, a white man whose religious sensibility, honed on the doe-eyed Virgin Mary, is alien to the world she inhabits, she is struck by the total absence of human recognition on his face. So, because Mr. Jakubowski has an image of whiteness as an image of humanity and divinity, Mr. Jakubowski does not recognize a young black girl standing before him. Similarly, Alexander points to another moment as Piccola is thrown out of Geraldine's house, and this is a black woman who has eschewed all traces of blackness in her own life. She sees a portrait of an anglicized Jesus looking down at her with sad and unsurprised eyes. So in Geraldine's house, Piccola sees an image of God who seems either incapable of helping her or complicit in her suffering. And Allen writes this as Morrison introducing us to one of the shortcomings of the Western model of God, namely the problem of how a supposedly omnipotent and loving God can allow the existence of evil and suffering. He goes on to say Morrison reintroduces the model of an inadequate God, of a deity incapable of alleviating or unwilling to rectify the injustices of human society. And this is as she recounts Charlie Breedlove's childhood. So when Charlie is a child, he watches a black man break open a watermelon, and he sees that black man as God, this evil black man who can break the world as God. And that is compared to the white image of God, says Charlie, a nice old white man with long white hair, flowing white beard, and little blue eyes that look sad when people died and mean when they were bad. And so in Charlie's eyes, this white image of God is, as Alexander says, woefully inadequate. And so Alexander goes from talking about Charlie to talking about Pauline, his wife. And he says, Pauline has also adopted the Western theological tradition of either or thinking, of believing that the differences between good and evil, righteous and unrighteous, believer and non-believer are clearly demarcated. This ethical orientation is reflected in her belief that she is an upright and Christian woman burdened with a no-count man whom God wanted her to punish. And she rationalizes that her antipathy toward Charlie is sanctified by her God, for Christ the judge demands that she make her husband pay for his transgression. Yet Pauline cannot think of Christ the judge and Christ the redeemer simultaneously, because such a linkage does not fit the severely drawn categories of good and evil that she inherited from the dominant white culture. To her way of thinking, Charlie was beyond redemption. Pauline's religion, built on such a rigid and unforgiving foundation, cannot tolerate the notion that a man like Charlie could be a blend of both good and bad, that he quite simply could be human. Consequently, she never recognizes God's fourth face. Now, to this point, so Pauline Breedlove cannot recognize that God produced the evil that was in her husband, but she also doesn't recognize the evil that's in herself. She doesn't recognize that her treatment of her daughter is evil, that her treatment of her son is evil, that her treatment of her husband is evil. Because Pauline aligns herself with whiteness, she finds value and importance and validation in whiteness. And so we see her go into a white woman's home and treat the home as an extension of her own, while also disregarding her actual home. So all of her love and all of her care goes to the white person's home. All of her sweetness and all of her nurture goes to a white woman's daughter, while her own daughter descends into madness and chaos and trauma and abuse and neglect. So Alexander then goes on to say that it's because Pauline is cut loose from her cultural moorings, that if she valued blackness more, she would value black people more, and she would see the God in black people. And so the essay goes on to talk about how humanity is inextricably linked to God. And so Alexander's supposition is that God cannot be fully God, or at least a God to humanity, without also being in some sense human. So God would not be able to make humans if God did not know what made someone human. And then he looks at African folklore, and he begins by saying African storytellers have given God a human face, portraying him as a lovable character with a sense of humor and a streak of fallibility. And he says that this God, who also possesses many of the characteristics of his imperfect creation, is a far cry from the West omnipotent, infallible God who despises human frailty. And then Alexander compares Baldwin and Morrison again, saying, obviously, neither Baldwin nor Morrison sees a movement from an African to a Western sensibility as an appropriate step for a productive and authentic life. So the idea is that the more one espouses whiteness, the less one operates authentically. Meaning, the more white identified a character becomes, the less likely he, she, or they will be to be successful at being a fully formed black person. So he goes on to ask a question. The question then arises, how does Morrison demonstrate the qualities of an African-inspired vision of God in her fiction? And he says, of course, no serious reader of Morrison's will begin an analysis with the assumption that there is a simple, clear-cut answer to any question regarding her richly complex work. And her betrayal of an African religious sensibility offers no exception. Her selection of the fourth face of God underscores her commitment to demonstrating that the sensibility is inherently attuned to the notion that God is much larger than the image to which the divine has been confined by Western theology. And a significant part of that largeness is built on the belief that God is in some way responsible, either as an active participant or a willing spectator, in the tragedies that befall humans. So God sees the suffering coming and does nothing to preempt or prevent it. And so Alexander says that sounds a little similar to a Judaic faith that sees God as many things, from protector to the engine behind catastrophe. And then he says that traditional African religions tend to understand tragedy as something that happens regardless of what humans have or have not done. So the question becomes, are the bad things that happen to us a response to something we've done, or an independent occurrence that has no bearing on the goodness or the quote-unquote badness of another person? So Alexander then goes in to look at some African diasporic religious traditions And he says that in the Zulu, evil is not seen as an independent, autonomous power, but as a force that draws its strength from God, the sky, God of the sky, the ancestors, and medicine. He says in the Ashanti, nature is populated by malignant spirits of fairies and forest monsters who are subservient to the supreme being. He says that this notion of evil is even replicated in Olada Equiano's autobiography, when Equiano recalls the traditions he learned as a child in Africa. And he writes that his people, and this is Equiano, his people believe that God governs events, especially our deaths or captivity. And this idea is echoed by Zora Neale Hurston, who in Their Eyes Were Watching God writes, all gods dispense suffering without reason. And then later on, when the characters in The Eyes Are Watching God find themselves in the path of a hurricane, say they wonder if God meant to measure their puny might against his. So after that, Alexander goes on to look at the Akan, a cultural group which includes the Ashanti, and they believe the Nana, the principle that makes for good, is himself or itself participator in the life of the whole and is not only head. So in short, an African sensibility includes the idea that God is present and participatory in evil. So he goes back to Morrison and he says Morrison definitely works a similar sense of tragedy in The Bluest Eye. And that similar sense of tragedy is one that comes from an African folktale. And it says, Shika Kunamo, which is the besetting one, sits on the back of every one of us and we cannot shake him off. And so that attempts to explain why there's pain in the earth or on the earth. And so this is Morrison in The Bluest Eye attempting also to explain the tragedy. So he writes, in the world of the breedloves, it seems that much more than human forces are working against them, that in fact, the earth itself might have been unyielding. And he points to another moment about the breedloves and says they seem willing to exchange their personhood and consequently their heritage for models of themselves that only strengthen in their minds the cultural norms that make them hate their true selves. So this is a family of people who believes that evil is a cloak that they wear, that they are dressed, that they are wrapped in ugliness. And so that is why people treat them the way that they do, because of their appearance, and that there's nothing that they can do about it. So Alan asked the question, is there no limit to the amount of evil one can tolerate? And the answer quite possibly might be yes, since Piccola descends into madness. And so he says, Morrison does not intend for us to conclude that the African sensibility toward tragedy is one of complacent and powerless acceptance. To the contrary, she suggests that the correct stance for one to take with regard to tragedy is not passively to give in to its inevitability, but like the people of the bottom in Sula, to be actively engaged with it so that it can be dealt with, survived, outwitted, triumphed over. Yet Piccola is ill-equipped to outwit and triumph over her tragic situation. She lacks the cultural rootedness or the intestinal fortitude to outlast the forces that work to annihilate her personhood. And in the end, she accepts as her destiny the destruction of her true being in favor of an insanity-induced self-image that validates in her mind the inherent inferiority of her heritage. So because she has accepted that she should be hated by the world, she does not and cannot fight against the forces that seek to demean and disparage her. That she does not have the strength to fight back because she's accepted within herself that she deserves ill treatment. So Alexander uses a quote from Toni Morrison to explain what Morrison is doing in The Bluest Eye. He writes, like the people of the bottom, he, Soaphead Church, believes that since decay, vice, filth, and disorder were pervasive, they must be in the nature of things. That evil exists because God had created it. So, is evil a part of God, or is evil the creation of God? And are those two one and the same? So he talks a little more about Soaphead Church and says that Soaphead begins to see himself as the personification of God, as the embodiment of God, so much so that Soaphead Church decides that he can do God's work. But he says that there's another character, Claudia Maxier, and about her, Alexander says, in this sense, she becomes a Christ figure. Piccola Breedlove becomes a Christ figure. The one who takes on the ugliness or the sin of the world around her and consequently absolved others of their feelings of inferiority. But Morrison's final image of God is an aborted one. Unlike Christ, there is no resurrection for Piccola. And so as he begins to close, he says the experiences of Pauline and Piccola suggest that it is impossible for a character to adopt to white society without sacrificing one's true self. And then he points out an example of 3 women who do not adapt to white society, who resist even any sense of propriety. And they are the 3 prostitutes who live above the Breedloves. And what Alexander says about them is that they define themselves rather than relying on the judgments of others. And then Alexander goes on to talk about the Maxier family and how they seem largely unconcerned with fulfilling any roles prescribed by outside influences. So, from Alexander's perspective, it is Claudia Maxier who has the most authentic existence, because even her telling the story is a sign that she has come to recognize the value of rediscovering the past. Because in The Bluest Eye, it is the story of a young girl, but it is the story of a young girl told by someone who's looking back on the experience of childhood. And so Alexander believes that that rediscovery, that recovery, that discovery implies that Claudia lives an authentic life. And he closes by again mentioning Claudia. And he says, when Claudia observes her parents, She recognizes that their authenticity is not based on the literal meaning of the words they speak, but in the way they are spoken. And so the story she gives us is not one that allows us to march straight toward the truth, for such a path would oversimplify a world that is so full of evil and so far beyond explanation that it need not be explained. It can only be dealt with, survived, outwitted, triumphed over. Claudia's narrative, which has a circular and some might say elusive quality to it, is in itself a reflection of the image that is so central to her heritage, the fourth face of God. So in short, Alexander walks through African religious traditions, attempting to align Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye with those traditions. And Alexander finds proof of that, or finds support for that, in that African traditions include the presence of a fallible God and also the ever presence of evil as a part of God's self. And so in The Bluest Eye, where we have this quote unquote fourth face, and that is the presence of evil, Alexander looks at Toni Morrison's Sula, which is her second novel, to see the ways in which people in the bottom dealt with evil, and then compare that to the way in which evil is presented in The Bluest Eye. So the question we ask ourselves after having read The Bluest Eye might be, why does this happen to Piccola? What is it about this little black girl that makes her susceptible to such damage, to such despair, to such devastation? And is it God's fourth face? Is it the presence of unrestrained or unchecked evil in the world? Or is the presence of that evil and Piccola's inability to respond to it is it informed or influenced by Piccola's lack of cultural mooring? Because her mother, Pauline, had to some extent divorced herself from her cultural foundation. And that her father was unable to give her that foundation. So, in other words, Claudia does not fall victim to the same self-hate as Piccola, because Claudia's family, Mr. and Mrs. McTeer, had strong cultural footing, but Piccola does not. And because Pauline instead invests all her time and energy in whiteness, then Pauline cannot give her daughter what she needs to survive. And so when we think through the fourth face, quite possibly the fourth face is not just evil, but the fourth face is those the fourth face is those parts of our cultural and societal understanding that attempt to make us inauthentic. The fourth face of evil is prioritizing whiteness over blackness. The fourth face of evil is accepting a subordinated or marginalized position in society. And so that's why it can be something that someone can't get off one's back, because it's something that someone has lived with and accepted as a part of his or her life. Thank you.